Is this on? First thing I'd like to say, and really the only thing I'd like to say, is I think we live in a wonderful era. An era that's unprecedented in its peace and prosperity. And I think it's the era that gives rise to books and ideas like abolishing war. So I think it's a wonderful thing that we live in that sort of era. I think that era exists for four primary reasons. I think the careful non-use of nuclear weapons basically killed great power war. At the beginning, they said it couldn't be done. We certainly had some scary moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the intelligence shown by the U.S. side in creating the concept of mutual assured destruction and selling that notion to the Soviets succeeded in creating this broad understanding that nuclear war could not happen, and that the only reason to have nuclear weapons is to prevent great power war. The success of that model is unprecedented. It's unassailable. There has not been direct great power war since the invention of nuclear weapons. I think the second great thing that's happened is the spread of the international liberal trade order modeled on the U.S. system. The U.S. spent many decades trying to figure out what it was to be a multinational union. It fought its own mini world war in 1860 to 1865 to determine the course of how these states would come together peacefully under conditions of collective security and open borders. As I mentioned in my talk, the United States created the first multinational single currency in 1862. It was created by Abraham Lincoln. The Europeans are to be commended for what they've done since the Second World War. And if they want to believe that they've created multinationalism with the EU, I think that's perfectly fine. I think the third big reason why we live in such a peaceful era is the fact that the United States stepped up and played the benevolent hegemon for the last 7 decades. The first 45 years of which involved standing up to the Soviets. During that time period, the United States made multiple mistakes. And we've heard 2 of them described here today. Chile in 73, Iran in, I think, 56. So the United States was not perfect in its execution of trying to defend the West and spread an international liberal trade order across that time period. But I don't think anybody in this room is going to argue that it would have been better if the Soviet Union had won. I lived in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. I think anybody who's gone there since and seen the horrific legacy of environmental damage and the repression that occurred and the mass murdering that occurred, marking Joseph Stalin second only to Mao in terms of killing people in the 20th century. It was a worthy effort. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a dramatic drop in conflict around the world. We've seen the United States be involved in all sorts of interventions around the world, reflecting not hegemony, but the global demand for Leviathan. Have we succeeded in every instance? Absolutely not. America has a terrible lack of patience for winning the peace. Terrible lack of patience. But when you add up all the trends I cited in my talk, there's no question the world got dramatically better when the U.S. stepped up and allowed for the complete dissolution of the European model of colonialization. When America took over the system at the beginning of the Cold War, there was really only the Americans and the Soviets. But somehow this system of American hegemony has encouraged the rise of roughly a dozen great powers. So we talk now about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We talk about the Mint, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey. What hegemon encourages the peaceful rise of competing powers? Only one hegemon in human history. I think the fourth key reason why we live in a world where we can talk about abolishing war and have, for all practical purposes, abolished most definitions of war. No great power war in 7 decades. Nuclear war never happened. Biological warfare yet to happen. Chemical warfare been very rare since World War I. Most prominent usage by Saddam Hussein in Iraq against his own people. State-on-state wars almost completely disappeared. Now we are left with civil strife and terrorism. The fourth reason, beyond the careful non-use of nukes, beyond the spread of an international liberal trade order modeled on the United States, beyond the benevolent U.S. role as Leviathan in the system these past 70 years, for which we receive virtually no thanks and mostly a lot of opprobrium and labeling. Fourth reason is the rules. Globalization doesn't come with a ruler. Globalization comes with rules. The United States pioneered the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which became the WTO, where the country most sued since that court was created is the United States. And the country that has lost more suits than anybody else in the world in the WTO court has been the United States. So time and time again, the United States has gone out of its way to create rules that penalize itself more than the rest of the planet. So what do we end up with after all that effort? Gratitude in some places, a lot of conspiracy thinking in the rest. I will admit, I was very disappointed to hear the conversations, the presentations this morning. I'm very disappointed in the tone of this book when it romanticizes terrorism. I find that morally reprehensible. What we end up with at the end of the U.S. hegemonic period are the best problems we've ever had in this world. We got people joining the middle class at 70 million persons a year. We have a global middle class, 60% of the world's population, for the first time in history. That's the primary achievement of the American-led globalization system, the creation of a global middle class. Europe got a middle class at the beginning of the 20th century and developed fascism and communism to deal with it, and spent 5 decades killing themselves at unprecedented numbers. What we have the opportunity to achieve with the global middle class today is finally the feminization of politics, finally the equal rights for women around the world. There are traditional cultures spread around this planet that find the elevation of women to equality reprehensible, anathema. Radical Islamic fundamentalism does not accept the notion of gender equality. And one of the most subversive things the United States has ever done is to spread those global networks. Because those global networks don't care if you're a male or a female. So by definition, in a world dominated by males, it empowers women more than men. And that, quite frankly, is why radical Islamists and the fundamentalists from that crowd detest and fear and are willing to do anything to stop the spread of so-called Western values. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Barrett. Thank you for alluding to the U.S. initiatives. You talk about collective security, open borders, and of course the other one is related to collective security is also exporting security. Exporting security, we must not get it wrong from the negative feeling. Exporting security by the United States here is initiatives and efforts promoting peace through show of presence, through training, through friendly visits, port of calls, and a host of others. And you also alluded to this has been a wonderful era, and I think it is left for us to try and either we retain that or we improve on that wonderful era. Let me now turn to Dr. Michael Shilsodowski, now doctor in Professor Galtung's books on the 20 recommendations. He made some reference to national policy. And at this stage, let me quote what von Clausewitz, a Prussian general and famous military theorist, said in his book on war. He said, "War is merely a continuation of policy by other means. We see that war is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried by other means." How do you relate that to, yes please, to Galtung's 20 recommendations? Why are you raising your hand, please? Can you keep your questions? I'm sorry. Please, if you have any questions, can we keep it? No. I'm sorry, we will not allow any questions at this stage. Thank you very much. Please, Doctor.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, I have been a fan of Dr. Johann Galtung since my student days and had the opportunity of meeting him in another life many, many years ago. I think we have to reflect today on two important issues. One is Johann Galtung's analysis and understanding of conflict resolution with a view to reaching world peace, including the criminalization of war. But the other, which raises a very disturbing element, is that that kind of conflict resolution is an impossibility when the warmongers of this world believe in their own propaganda that somehow America has a holy crusade to wage by killing people all over the world. Okay? There's nothing historic, Mr. Barnett, in the act of killing, as you describe it, the Leviathan, which is a marine monster. I understand that you were part of the advisory team to Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld, from our point of view, is a war criminal. It's a judgment of the War Crimes Tribunal. Mr. Barnett, you are a visible minority in this venue, and I think we would have appreciated some dialogue and understanding, and perhaps that you would recognize that your government, certainly in the post-war years, since the Truman administration, with the Truman Doctrine of George Kennan, the bombing of Hiroshima, the Korean War. And I quote, Curtis LeMay stated at the time, we must have killed some 20% of the North Korean population and destroyed every single city. Yes, they did. Yet, in conventional parlance, North Korea is a threat. They lost, according to experts, between 25 and 30% of their population. And we can go on. Indonesia, let me quote. Indonesia, how many people did you kill in Indonesia there on blacklists, okay? And in fact, the CIA documents were declassified, so we know exactly how many people, because you actually admit to killing about 500,000 people. And then you have also, I mean, the whole series of wars in which the United States has participated, which has resulted in millions and millions of casualties. And I would expect that somebody who's an advisor to the Pentagon and who is open to conflict resolution would at least acknowledge the atrocities committed by the United States as well as its allies in various conflicts around the world. The US-sponsored killings in Indonesia, and I quote, and this comes from the New York Times, the United States and British governments supported by Australia were deeply complicit in the murder of more than 500,000 alleged communist sympathizers. And then renowned New York Times columnist James Reston celebrated, quote, a glee of light in Asia and wrote a kid-glove version he had clearly been given. The Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, who was visiting the US, offered a striking example of his sense of humor. With 500,000 to 1 million communist sympathizers knocked off, he said, I think it's safe to assume a reorientation has taken place. Is that what you want? Just kill people and then we go the American way? Well, Mr. Thomas, Doctor, the United States is in a crisis. Health coverage has collapsed, even under Obamacare, which is fake. People are impoverished. This is fairly well documented. Extrajudicial killings are legal. Civil rights are in a sham. Compare that to the legacy of Tun Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, where social democracy has been built, public housing, health care, and yet we are here presented with the American model. Look at the countries that have fallen under your brunt. Afghanistan, prosperous, secular civil society in the 1970s and 80s. And who have you supported? You supported Al-Qaeda. I don't even need, I mean, if you can refute anything I've got to say, go ahead and do it. But Al-Qaeda was supported by the United States. And what did it lead to? From a secular Muslim society with advanced rights for women, education, health. You eliminated the schools, you established your CIA-sponsored Quranic schools, and there we are. We have a country which is destroyed and which ultimately was the cradle of civilization. All the countries you've destroyed are the cradle of civilization. And your foot soldiers in Syria and Iraq are going ahead, killing people, and then of course you say we're going after them, but that's a bloody lie. They're trained in Saudi Arabia, they're protected by the US High Command, they have logistic support out of Israel, and then we are told that America is the savior of the world. America doesn't like to do its dirty work. It gets other people to do it for it. They're proxies. Okay? And all those Islamic organizations, including the ones in this country, Jemiah Islami, we know they're supported by intelligence agencies. It goes indirectly through Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But ultimately, I think we were expecting a dialogue and not an assertion of something which is fiction. You live in a life of fiction and you believe your own propaganda, and I understand that this is the kind of analysis which is fed to the five-star generals and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, they need, of course, a justification to wage war. So then it gets back to the teachings of Johann Galtung. Professor Galtung, can we negotiate as we used to negotiate during the Cold War era? Can we negotiate under conditions where international diplomacy has collapsed, where the United States is supporting a neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine, documented, okay, with the insignia? They're going in, they're training them, and where they're accusing Russia of intervening and imposing sanctions on whoever refuses their dictates. I think what we are dealing with is the United States is both an imperial power, but it's also a failed nation. And we should certainly follow the suggestions of Johann Galtung and make a list of the architects of war and the victims of war in the millions. The architects of war, I think we can count them. And we'll start by identifying the heads of state and heads of government which are part of this bombing campaign against Syria and Iraq, and which have troops stationed in different countries around the world imposing their proxy regimes. That is the message that I'd like us to debate. And with all due respect, we are open to discussion and debate with Dr. Barnett, but I think I had to set the record straight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Michael.